Has everybody received a copy of the amendments? Senator Lisa Nicholas, we were with you.
If I may just review the amendment, Mr. Speaker, and yield to any other speakers.
Thank you. On the amendments, any other senator wish to be heard?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So this is the amendment that we are addressing, line 2 and 3, page 5 of the bill. Just to clarify, Section F, failure a peace officer is deemed to have failed to comply with this policy when that officer's performance in a PFQT test is below the standard as established by standard form. What is the standard form? Are you trying to put the AFI standard?
Yes, Senator, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All right. So I guess we're dealing with the F on page 5, line 2 and 3. Any other senator wish to be heard on that amendment? Any other senator wish to be heard on this amendment? F, failure. Is there an objection to the, Senator San Nicolas? San Augustine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, as I read the amendment that was offered by Senator Torres, I'd only ask that with all the amendments that's being offered, the bottom line is actually to allow the peace officers to have some time. And it being said that until a physical fitness is recommended by the Post Commission and adopted by the Guam Legislature, why don't we just keep that and get rid of everything else and stop whatever's going on? So the threat's not there to any of the peace officers, and then until the Post has a program, submit it, and then move on from there. I'd like to recommend that if that may be acceptable to the sponsor.
Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do have, I guess this is more of a legal/technical question. This is in reference to the amendment on line 21 through 19 on pages 2 to 3 of the bill.
There's been 3 pages of amendments, so I think if we deal with it one at a time. I think the first one that was spoken to was F, page 5, line 2 and 3. It has failure.
Based on the original, Mr. Speaker, that we asked to be clarified in this manner, the first section was a page 2, line 17, which is this item here. The page 2, line 17, which is what I'm referencing now at this juncture.
I understand, but the first one that got up and spoke was about this failure one.
I'm sorry?
I understand, but the first person that got up wanted to address this issue. And so if we can just address this one and dispose of it, we can go back to the other one.
I yield then, but I do have I would like to speak.
Anyone else on the failure amendment? Any objection to it? Objection? Any other senator wish to speak on it? All those in favor of the amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Please keep your hand up so the clerk can count. On that first amendment by Senator Torres. Motion fails. On the second amendment by Senator Torres on page page 2 and 3.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd first like to begin with a legal/technical question. This is a new bill, and so with this amendment, if we look at subsection A, it says that the PFQT policy shall be phased into implementation over a 5-year period from the effective date of this regulation. Now, my question is, since we're passing a whole new bill, does this reset the effective date of the regulation so that by passing this bill, it now becomes 5 years from enactment of this act?
If I may yield, Mr. Speaker, the reason that I wanted to keep with the existing Air Force standard is I believe that if you have the same standard, then no, it does not reset. If you implement a modified standard, which is a new testing standard, I believe that that does reset the clock, and so you start from test 1. Whereas in this case, it doesn't penalize, for example, those officers who have already, over the course of the past 2 years or less, have gone through the examinations and have passed. So by kicking it out 5 years, you're not penalizing those who have already passed the test based on the Air Force standards that are in place, and you don't restart the clock. And that was the whole idea of putting something new. You can't hold someone to a timeline midway. You have to, when you change something, that starts the clock at number 1, at the first post. So to your answer, no, it does not reset.
I would like legal clarification, Mr. Speaker, because based on what I'm reading on the original bill, the original language was a 3-year period, and this new language would make it a 5-year period. And so if we reset the period, if we create a new schedule and make it effective the date of this regulation, does that start it all over again from enactment? I would understand if we just would, if the amendment was to keep the original language, because technically we're not changing the original timeline, we're not changing the effective date of this regulation. But if we do change the schedule, if we make it go from 3 years to 5 years, which is what this amendment would do, would this language here that makes it be the effective date of this regulation make it relevant to when this actual bill is enacted?
Mr. Speaker, to that point, I would not have an objection to maintaining the same 3-year period. The operative word here, though, is from the effective date of this regulation. So the regulation became effective as of 2014. So if you take 3 years out of 2014, it brings you to 2017, December. If you go with a 5-year period from the effective date of the regulation, it's 2014 plus 5. It'll bring you to 2019, yes, 2019. So that's the idea, is you can't read it separate and apart from the last few words of the sentence, which is from the effective date. The effective date of the regulation was 2014. But if we want to hold understanding that the testing and retesting has a 90-day gap between one and the next, arguably they have 1 whole year. If they test in December 2017, they have, I believe, a series of other tests, if I'm understanding it correctly from the sponsor's testimony. Because I guess the confusion here is the sunset of full compliance 2017, where all tests and all passage had to be made. And I think that's the concern, and there's a difference of opinion as to whether 2017 is the drop dead date, and if they have passed their test, then they're out. But we know that that's not the case from the testimony that was provided previously. I would not object to shortening it back to 3 years. My main concern is sticking with the same standard, because I believe if you change the standard, you restart the clock. I don't intend to restart the clock. And I don't also agree with the modified standard, which was the basis of this amendment.
I'm just trying to get a handle, Mr. Speaker, on what may operatively occur. If I could just request a brief recess to confer with legal counsel.
We'll take a short recess. We're back on. Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to confer with legal counsel. Just for benefit of the record, it has been clarified that this amendment would not reset the effective date of the regulation. It still would be what was originally codified. Basically, all this would do is extend it from a 3-year to a 5-year amortization from the initial inception date. So I'm comfortable with that. I'm pretty comfortable with this amendment, but again, I mean, you know, when it comes down to the standards that I spoke about earlier, we're basically giving an extension. You know, it's almost like instead of the clock ticking after the 3-year mark, and then you get your 90-day, you know, checks. It's a 5-year mark. I'm not quite sure where I stand on it altogether, Mr. Speaker, only because I made my point very clear earlier about just maintaining the standards that we already adopted. There were some statements made with respect to the amendments about how, you know, we got to look at the whole picture. I agree with that too. I just you know, I tend to look at things from the whole picture of how everyone else is being affected too when they're being held to a standard as well. And you know, when we had the certification issues with the teachers and the praxis, a lot of them wanted concessions that weren't afforded, and we got through that. I mean, there were some people who were unhappy with it, but we got through it, and here we are today with a system that's working within the parameters that we set originally with the Department of Education. So I appreciate the intent of the amendment to try and bring things back. If this is something that I think would get more support than the greater change that's being proposed in the original bill, then I probably would be amenable to supporting this amendment. So I'll go ahead and yield to any other additional commentary from my colleagues at this time while I consider my position on the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Torres.
Mr. Speaker, the retiring speaker brings up a good point, and I believe that it may actually be necessary as we consider that the goal is to have the Commission provide to the legislature recommended changes to the standard in July of 2018. If we adopt a 5-year period, then arguably when the new standard comes in, it resets the clock for them. So under the new standard, they'll have 5 years to get people up to fitness level, which I think may be a little too generous. So it's an interesting effect how the implication of this towards the situation now will be different when the standards change, because then there's a reset. You have to hold, you have to restart the testing based on the new standard. So I would offer to further amend this amendment by striking any reference to 5-year period and reverting back to 3-year period, the way that it was originally. So that would be my amendment, and I believe it appears in subsections A and in subsection B. And please excuse that double crossover on the letter B of that section. It was inadvertent.
On the amendment just made by Senator Torres, any objection? Objection. Senator Vice Speaker, you had a question?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Okay, I'm not sure if I missed something or I'm just getting very confused, because I thought the whole point of changing 3 to 5 in the current statute is because the 3 years is December 2017. It's in a month or two. And so we need to change that deadline. We need to put it out further. So keeping it at 3, I mean, we're at the same deadline. So I thought we want to at least give them the deadline until December 2018, which is, I guess you would
2019.
say 2019. Okay, then yeah. So 5 years. I think 5 years was 5 years would keep the current standard up until you've got a new standard in place already, right?
There's been an objection to the amendment. Any other senator wish to be heard on the amendment? Do you wish to? Oh, Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, now it's getting a little confusing. But I guess the question I have, and again, I guess, well, we're addressing the amendment to the amendment, right? And there's an objection to the amendment to the amendment. And the amendment to the amendment was to revert it back to a 3-year standard as opposed to a 5-year standard. But I do need to at least ask the question that, I guess, well, let me just state something first. I'm a little confused because if we're saying we're going to give them an extra 2 years to meet the current standard, and yet we expect the proposal from the Post Commission to come in June or July of 2018, and we act upon it then in essence, it seems to me that nobody would really have to take the test. I mean, or at least those who have failed would no longer have to take a test if some new standards were imposed, or at least, sometime in 2018. And yet we're going to extend this out for 5 years to 2019 under the present standards. And so there's a little bit of a, I don't know, I guess a dilemma in my head. It's like, well, is that really what's going to happen if we do extend it out to 5 years? And I'm not sure who to ask, because the amendment to the amendment, really, the sponsor says, well, no, okay, let's bring it back to 3 years. But if there's an objection to bringing it back to 3 years, and we extend it out to 5 years, then we're stuck in a situation where people really don't have to meet the current standards until 2019, but somewhere before 2019, the standards are going to change. So nothing happens. And I don't know who to ask, but I'm just wondering, am I off track? Or is there some clarity that can be provided to me by somebody? Because it seems really gray, very gray. I don't know. And again, this is not one of the areas of expertise that I have. So again, for somebody who is not knowledgeable as others in this room may be, perhaps, I don't know, maybe I could ask the author of the bill herself, and since she's the one who raised the objection. May I do that?
Anyone wish to yield to the senator's question?
Can he please repeat the question?
The question is that the amendment to the amendment right now, right, and before I can make a decision on whether I can support the amendment to the amendment, and that's to bring it, right now the amendment reads it's going to be extended for an extra 2 years to 5 years.
Mr. Speaker, I think that it is not the author of the bill that should be responding to the amendment. It should be the proffer of the amendment.
No, because the concept really is what happens. Since you're going to object to bringing it back to 3 years, that means that you're satisfied with keeping the 5-year period in.
No, I object to the 5-year period also.
But by objecting to it, what?
The whole, I think that what it is it's a sequence of things that are trying to change the bill. And so if the sequence changes the bill already has three levels of accountability. One is December 2017 with the interim standard, 2 July 2018, where they submit their individual PT plans that's approved by the legislature, and then 3 in the year 2020, if they cannot meet the standard that they introduce themselves, they go back to the AFI. So I don't really know what is the question on this bill, the intent, but from what I'm seeing is that there's trying to be a sequence of amendments made to make changes to the bill's timeline configuration. So that is why I objected.
Would the sponsor care to try to address Senator Espaldola's question?
And if it's an irrelevant question, then just say it's irrelevant, and I'll accept that, and I'll have to try to figure it out myself. But right now, it does pose a question in my mind that if we extend it out to 5 years, and I guess that's why I hesitate to ask the sponsor this, because she's trying to bring it back to 3 years. But if we do extend it out to 5 years, of which there's an objection to bring it back to 3 years, then during that 5-year period, if the rules change or if the standards change, in essence, any officer who has failed the test or who has not taken the test just yet gets a free pass to not even have to take a test.
Point of information, Mr. Speaker, the whole amendment, just to be clear, I object because it's asking to keep the AFI standard and removing the interim. If you read the whole amendment, we're talking about this amendment, right, Senator?
I understand.
Okay, so that's why, if you're asking me.
Well, I mean, but it goes to the issue of whether I can support the amendment to the amendment, and maybe I guess I'll just...
The way that I look at it is this. The first public law required that there be full compliance within 3 years. So it's set in 2014, and 3 years would be December 2017. This bill is providing for this bill is providing, well, we'll just address the key here, which is for the Post Commission to come back to the legislature in July of 2018 and give us a recommendation on what standard should be the new standard. If they're going to replace the AFI, what is the new standard? And we have to agree. If in July 2018 there is no agreement and it doesn't fall in place, and this is according to the law, then everything reverts in 2020, January 2020, everything reverts back to what we have right now, that standard. When I was proposing, because there's some concern about, you know, if you give them 2 years, then it's 2 years of inaction. Nothing will happen. You won't achieve the intended goal of having officers get fit. So I thought, well, then let's just go back and go back to where we are now, where the timeline is 2017. Because if it's true that 2017 isn't a drop-dead date where everyone should have passed the test by 2017, and if you didn't, you will be either demoted, transferred, maintained, suspended, or your certification revoked. There's some things. So in considering whether people will still be on the job in 2017, and the test can be administered in 2017, and if they fail, they're allowed to retest 90 days later, and if they fail that second one, 90 days later, and if they fail that third one, 90 days later. Well, if you add 90 times 4, you're up to a year. So if you go from December 2017, assuming the year, then December 2017 to December 2018. In between that, you're already working on an interim, or you're working on maybe substituting out. If they give us a new standard, that restarts the clock. So the way that I'm looking at it is the easiest and most logical route is to not play around with different standards pending another change. The most logical route is stick with the standard you have now. If we contemplate a change around July, after July 2018, then holding us to to this current timeline only means that even those who have not passed, right, a little less than half have passed. We're talking about the more than one half that have not passed. Even that group still has the opportunity to test in December and fail, to retest 90 days later and fail, retest a third time and fail before they have to test the fourth time. So I believe that there is protection there and job security there until the new standard is proposed to us and we can adopt it. I just worry that you're playing with standards that goes from what people perceive as a high standard with the AFI to what I see as a very low standard with this modified one. You adopt this now and say that this is the interim, and then you come back in July. You know, stick with something consistent. You've got half of them that have already made the target. So you work on the other half. That was the whole basis of this law, I believe, was to get people up to a standard. So if half of you have made it, work on the other half. And so I think that also when you think about what happens later on, when the new standard comes in play, assuming it does, a new standard is introduced in July of 2018 and it becomes the new standard. When you have a new standard for testing, that restarts the testing again going forward. You can't go backwards. You can't say, all right, you failed, you passed, or say you failed twice on the old standard. We're going to hold that against you when we have the new one. It restarts. It's a new slate. So I don't think there's a harm if, in fact, those that did not pass, starting the testing in 2017, they have 4 options to take it. 90-day gap between, that's 1 year out. I think by that time we should have adopted the new one. If July 2018 is the day to submit it, we should have adopted it by then. So that's what I mean. And then what it does is it stays consistent with the spirit of the initial public law, which was we need to get these people up. 3 years is a sensible time to get them fit and to do all the remediation to get them fit. And so I'm going back to that. I'm really trying to, as best as I can, preserve what was a sound policy decision. And I know we've run into obstacles, so we're giving them the option now to change that standard. So, I hope I've adequately addressed your concerns.
Yes, I guess in a roundabout way. And really, the only thing that we're really addressing right now, just to bring everybody back into focus, is the amendment to the amendment to change it from 5 years, which is in the amendment right now, back to the 3-year standard. And that was the basis of my question, because there was an objection to moving it from the back to a 3-year standard. And so if there was an objection to moving it back, that means that the 5-year standard stays in place, at least in this amendment. And because this is an amendment to the amendment that's being made, only moving it back from 5 years to 3 years. Am I misunderstanding this, Mr. Speaker? It looks like you...
I don't believe that the amendment has been adopted, and so there was a proposal to have the 5, but they amended it to 3 before there was a vote on the amendment. So it's
right. So right now, what's
3.
Before us, I believe that we have not yet determined is whether to adopt the motion or the amendment to the amendment, which changes this amendment before us from 5 years to 3 years. I believe that's the amendment to the amendment that's before us right now.
Mr. Speaker, if I may.
Yes.
In the Post-Commission Administrative Rules, it states, there is hereby established a policy that Category 1 and 2 peace officers shall meet a minimum physical fitness standard in order to obtain and maintain their certificates from Post-Commission. The standard shall be denominated the physical fitness qualifications and except for exceptions hereafter noted shall be equivalent to the U.S. Air Force test as currently embodied in Air Force Instruction 36-2905 dated 21 October 2013. And maybe this can further explain the issue here. The PFQT policy shall be placed into implementation over a 3-year period from the effective date of the regulation, which was 21 October 2013. There shall be a mandatory test at the beginning of the 2nd year and at the end of the 3rd year. All milestones will be calculated from the effective date of this regulation. Nothing herein shall be construed to restrict or impede agencies from testing peace officers during the initial 3-year period, in addition to the mandatory test at the beginning of the 2nd year and at the end of the 3rd year.
So I just want to clarify, Mr. Speaker, the only point I'm making is my understanding as I was listening here that the profferer of this amendment made a motion to amend this amendment, which basically right now says 5-year period, and she made amendment to this amendment to say let's bring it back to 3 years. That's what I believe is before us, and that was kind of my line of questioning.
Yes,
and that's all I was asking.
But the current law and the amendment hasn't been. The current law is 3.
Correct.
The amendment to the current law proposed here has not been adopted. We've not voted on this, and so it's still 3. She proposed 5, but then she's now taken it back to 3. But we're not stuck at 5 yet because we've not adopted 5 because that wasn't. We've not voted on it.
We have not adopted 5, but what is before us is this amendment, and this amendment she wanted to amend. And so, because that becomes an amendment to the amendment. So we're on that specific issue of whether we should move from 5, which is in this amendment, whether we'll allow her to, move it back to 3. That's the only issue I believe
Yes,
is before us.
yes,
And
but-
that we have not voted on.
Correct.
Because
Well,
there was an
both. We
objection.
haven't voted on either.
I'm sorry?
We haven't voted on either. There's
Right,
no
but we
5 or there's
can't
no
vote
3.
on the general amendment until we solve this amendment to the amendment procedurally. And that's all I'm saying.
Okay.
Thank
Yes.
you, Mr. Speaker. And that was the only question I had, which will help determine whether I can support her amendment to her amendment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other senator wish to be heard? There's been an. Do you wish to close, Senator? Oh, Senator Lee? No. Do you wish to close, Senator Lee?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the risk of confusing people any further, just please try to bring yourselves back to the basic objective of this amendment, which is to bring the standard back or not change the standard and to maintain it as such. And that is really what we're talking about. It's a lot cleaner, and you don't run the risk of adopting a low standard that later you're almost bound to because you set the precedent. So the precedent is set high. I think high is a good place to be. Unreasonably low interim standards is not the place to be. So I encourage my fellow colleagues and you, Mr. Speaker, to please support this amendment.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. It goes to the issue that I was just speaking about procedurally, that this amendment, we're not dealing with it yet. We're dealing with the amendment to this amendment because she wants to correct this amendment because right now it says 5 years. And then she made an amendment to the amendment to bring it back to 3 years. There was an objection to that. We have not resolved that question.
All right. Well, then let's address the 3, and then we'll go to the. All right. So before the body right now is just one thing. To go from 5 to 3 on this amended amendment. Any objection to going 5 to 3? There is, okay? All those in favor of going from 5 to 3 indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. All right, on the amendment with the 5-year, anybody wish to speak on that? Is there an objection to? There is an objection. So on the amendment as is before us with the 5-year, all those in favor, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. There's another sheet here that says to delete Appendix A and B of the bill. Do you wish to address that amendment?
I wish to withdraw that amendment.
All right. Any other on the main motion? Senator Estevez.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I understand concerns about standards, we do have to understand that the government is still growing and improving. It takes time to do that. I mean, I think the sheer fact that the agencies approached you back then to bring these standards really showed that there's a genuine care to improve our workforce, to be more professional, to grow. But with that, there are going to be bumps along the way. Nothing good happens overnight. It takes time to develop, takes time to grow, takes time to learn. And they've admitted it was a mistake choosing a standard this far out or this high. And I've been addressing this issue even when I was running for election, when this was brought to my attention. First thing that struck me was, why put in a federal standard? Why put in something that you can adjust locally? I mean, if they decided to adjust the Air Force AFI tomorrow, that could potentially put our peace officer force at risk. So something as little as that really let me see that they didn't put much thought into the draft of the bill. And I'll admit, originally I thought it was you, and I had put that on you. Now knowing the history that it was provided to you, again, I ask for your forgiveness and continued indulgence in the matter. But something that was mentioned earlier, and something I've experienced firsthand, is there's the key component missing here, which is the medical component. If you look, if you want to use, as we're applying here, military standards, which I'm familiar with, when you take the physical fitness aspect, you're looking at about a manual about yay big. But when you're talking about the medical standards that have direct applications to both, not just the physical assessment, but also the physical assessment with regards to the job performance and what they're supposed to do, it's about this big. You really can't have one without the other. There's a medical component. Now, how does this relate to us in government? How does this relate to what's going on? Now we can take this back to the courts, because I can already see it coming. As soon as people start getting booted for these standards and we start finding issues that some of the injuries that is precluding them from meeting these standards that we are setting, without anything codified in law to address these issues specifically, like we would see in a military branch, we're running the risk of having multiple lawsuits filed against GovGuam. Multiple lawsuits filed with Civil Service Commission. And trust me, we all know from experience, people have won those cases for a lot less. So what I'm saying is, it's good that we're moving towards these standards and practices, but we have to both be practical and we have to both ensure that it's all-encompassing. You really can't have one without the other. Because we don't know. What we're looking at here right now when we're voting on these issues is a number. You have X amount that passed, X amount that didn't pass. So I think most of us are in agreement that we need to have standards that are tailored now to what those agencies do. I think that being the key component, it's still important that we have to apply some other measures. And until we do that, we need to ensure that the departments can still run appropriately. We need to ensure that we're not, again, I still believe it was an arbitrary standard. Because you ask the justification, let's just look at these 3 standards that already exist. Okay, let's just take the easiest one. Still doesn't fit the mold. So to look at an AFI standard, to look at a whole military standard and vote on it without even a good understanding of how that's really a piece of a bigger pie, I think is unfortunate. But I think it is important to understand, and we're moving in that direction where we're understanding that the different agencies have unique requirements. Respecting that, learning from it, and figuring out what works best for them, what works best for the people that they serve, and what works best for the government of Guam. And it's always going to be growing process. But to say, we're just kind of circumventing standards. Well, when they developed the AFI standards, they didn't have GovGuam in mind. That's something to keep in mind. You can't just blanket a standard and expect it to take shape. Now again, I commend some agencies and for people putting it in, and I don't think it is as penalizing. But we just need to admit, as a government, there were mistakes made along the way. They shot for the stars and didn't get them, but you know what? I still commend them for trying. But now that we know and have more information, we just need to take our time and fine-tune it, and find something better that's going to work for everybody. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. On the main motion, Senator Espaldon, and then Senator Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Actually, my area of interest right now is a very specific one, and this would be on page 4 of the bill. And on line 19, it basically deletes, after the fourth unsatisfactory testing, under existing law, basically hazardous and incremental pay may be denied. In this bill, there's a strikeout, and it's basically saying that increment pay may not be denied. By that strike through, that's basically what it says. And so I guess the question that I have is that if an officer, a peace officer, was due for an increment and fails the first test unsatisfactorily, basically is unsatisfactorily, doesn't meet the test, the requirements of the test, is he still due the increment?
Do you wish to yield?
Yes, the thought behind this, Mr. Speaker, is that in the military we perform physical fitness tests every year, and we still receive our increments as accordingly, but we do not get, we're still flagged for schools and other courses. So we were just looking out for the best interests of the public safety officer.
And Mr. Speaker, I guess, and I might be wrong, but my understanding that to receive an increment, you would have to at least have a satisfactory rating. But if you fail the first increment, are you still rated satisfactorily? I mean, under existing GovGuam law, we're not talking military, we're talking GovGuam law. And maybe legal counsel might be able to answer that. I don't know, unless you can enlighten me, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, I don't have the answer for that, Mr. Speaker. I'm just thinking that the question is if you receive an unsatisfactory performance evaluation. So I think that in order to receive an unsatisfactory performance evaluation, we'd have to look at perhaps DOA and the other agencies to see how they would rate this physical fitness requirement as part of their performance evaluation. I said performance evaluation eval.
Right. But it seems to me, if I may just take a serious 1 or 2 minute break to ask legal counsel that, because if the standard for receiving an increment is based upon whether you have satisfactorily passed all the requirements that are necessary for your position, regardless of whether you're a peace officer or any other branch of government, I guess the question then becomes, does that apply here? Because the way this is written out, at least as post requirement in present law right now, is that it seems to me that it's different, a little bit different. That only after he failed, an officer fails after a fourth time, a fourth unsatisfactory, then he may be denied, not that he shall, but he may be denied an increment pay. And what we're saying is that, yeah, we don't want that. I mean, by this bill is basically saying, yeah, no, he should still get his increment, or that shouldn't even be a consideration if he fails 4 times. And so I'm just wondering, again, the wisdom in that is that he can't meet the standard after test after test after test, and he still can receive an increment, when in other agencies, if they don't meet their satisfactory level of performance, they may be denied an increment because they have not satisfactorily attained that level that is expected of them. then why are we applying it differently here? And so I guess with that reasoning, I would ask to remove the strike on line 19, page 4, and put back the increment, the possibility. And it's not a mandatory, it's discretionary. It may be considered. And I would like to keep that in place because, again, if somebody has failed 4 times and still refuses to really make any further effort, and yet he can still do that and receive an increment, then it's unfair to all the other employees in the government of Guam who have to reach that satisfactory level of performance, and they still may not be entitled to an increment.
Okay.
So that's my amendment to
So
this.
the amendment by Senator Espaldon is to reinstate the 2 words that were struck on page 4, line 19, and increment.
Yes.
Any senator wish to be heard on that? Any senator wish to be heard on reinstating the and increment on line 19, page 4?
Which is an existing law right now.
Yes. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to object to that amendment. I think that we owe it to our public safety officers to allow them that flexibility, and I think there was clarification that we needed to understand how DOA's performance evaluation worked, and also with legal what is currently in standing for their performance evaluation and how they are rated. Thank you.
May I just add one last piece to that, since there is an objection, and that is that in this bill we are lowering the standards, and yet in spite of lowering the standards and still not being able to pass after 4 attempts to pass those lowered standards, that they're still going to be allowed their increment. I don't think that's fair, Mr. Speaker, but that's my closing on this amendment.
Thank you. There's been an amendment. There's been an objection. All those in favor of the Espaldon amendment? Or does anybody else want to speak on the Espaldon amendment? All those in favor of the Espaldon amendment to reinstate the 2 words and increment on line 19, page 4? Does everybody understand what the amendment is? To reinstate the law that says that if it may be denied. All right, all those in favor of the Espaldon amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Amendment passes. Senator Morrison on the main motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the author may yield to a question real brief, I understand the author's been working closely with the agencies, but I just want to find out if this is modeled after anything out there. I know there's been a notion been made that we're lowering the standards. I'm not sure we're even lowering the standards. I'm not what we're comparing it to, but Mr. Speaker, I just want to know if we're mirroring after anything, or was this just created by our own respective agencies?
There's been a question posed by Senator Morrison. Senator Nelson, do you wish to yield as to how this standard was arrived at?
Can you please repeat the question? I didn't understand it.
I just wanted to figure out if, since this was done by our own respective agencies, I'm sure they had to at least model it after some sort of standard out there. So, I just want to be clear if we really are lowering the standard or just mirroring it after other types of jurisdictions that, we can at least say we're compatible with.
Do you yield?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The interim standard was adopted by the Post Commission. Just a little bit of history. After the public law, after the bill for the original public law passed, they were having challenges meeting the requirements of the AFI. So what they were doing was the Post Commission themselves was implementing modified PT standards and letting the agencies say, oh, these are the modified standards, you can test on them. And so really they weren't supposed to do that. But they took these standards and they saw that with the modified standard, they were starting to have an increase in those that were passing. And so we're kind of just going along, not just going along, but where the thought behind it was the modified standard would be the interim standard because it's an achievable standard for all, for the public safety officers that have been testing on the modified standard.
Is that satisfactory, Senator Morrison?
I thank the author, Mr. Speaker, for addressing my question. I just wanted to make sure, at least, that all of us here, even our public, we have made statements that we are lowering the standard, and I just want to make sure that that's benefit of the doubt with the agencies who put this together. I hope that we're not painting a picture out there that our officers or those in law enforcement that we are setting them up for lower standards. I think I did support the earlier amendments because I just felt we were trying to buy some time for some of those that needed more time to meet these standards. But the author feels comfortable that we are not lowering the standards and we're making this more compatible, at least with other jurisdictions, that not necessarily with the military. Then that's fair to at least put out there. Not trying to defend anybody here, but want to make it very clear that we are comparing ourselves to some other jurisdictions out there that have similar standards. So I was trying to look in the committee report if anything was stated regards to this, but I just wanted to make sure that was put out there.
Thank you. Anything further? Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion?
Mr. Speaker, I just would like to make a couple of amendments. The first amendment will be on line 24, page 2 of the bill. And I believe my colleagues have a copy. The interim standards indicated in Appendix A and Appendix B of this chapter until a physical fitness program is recommended by the Post Commission and adopted by the Guam legislature in form of a resolution or bill. We cross out, however, the events of the PFQT shall be conducted in compliance with Appendix B, and we just put it by the date specified in subsection 3115 of the bill. So basically, it's the same thing. We overlooked this section. It was a little bit unclear, so we added an amendment to make it more clear in the current bill.
Sorry, I couldn't understand what your amendment was, and I'm not sure if anybody else.
The amendment is we added Appendix B because we forgot to include that, and then we made it more clear, and we striked out, however, the events of the PFQT shall be conducted in compliance with Appendix B. We striked that out. and we put instead of that the date specified in subsection 3115 of this chapter. So it was basically a typo, and so we're just fixing that to make it clear. This is in line 24, page 2.
Just a point of information.
Okay, everybody, I'm sorry, there is a written amendment that's been distributed. Does everybody see it? Is there anyone who wishes to be heard on the amendment?
Just a point of information, and again, excuse me for my ignorance. It refers to Appendix B. I'm assuming that Appendix B is an existing law, but it's not included in this bill. Is that correct? Because I don't have an Appendix B attached. I have an Appendix A, but not an Appendix B.
The Appendix B shows the...
The question is it an existing law that we need to refer to today?
No, this should be in the bill. The Appendix B is the push-up component, the sit-up component.
On the one distributed, there's only an Appendix A.
Okay. It should be in the committee report.
I don't
It's
have
the
my...
modified test is what it is. It's the modified test specifications. The standard specifications modified.
Stapled together. I've not taken it apart.
I don't have my computer with me to access the committee report. Is it possible at least to get a copy?
Mr. Speaker, can I table that amendment until we get copies of the Appendix B from the committee report and move on to the next amendment so that we can move along faster, perhaps?
Sure, Bill, go ahead. Then we'll set this aside for a second until all of us can get a B.
Can we please get a copy of the Appendix B? Okay, the next amendment that I'd like to make is line 2, page 6 of the bill, and I thank my colleague who was so gracious to remind us of this. It only says December 2018. We included the specific date to be December 31st, 2018. Line 2, page 6.
Does everybody understand the amendment? Just putting in a date rather than December 2018, actually having 31st. Anyone wish to be heard on the amendment? Any objection to the amendment? Let's go back to your first one. Well, no. Did they? I guess we didn't get B. We'll stand in recess for a few minutes until Appendix B can be distributed. Can we have some order? Can we have some order, please? Senator Nelson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So everyone has a copy of Appendix B. It's basically just a description on how to perform each event of the of the interim standard. So you have the push-up component, the sit-up component, and so of course you don't want them doing. You want them to perform a standard, and so we just did a couple corrections because we overlooked it. We added line 24, page 2 of the bill. We're adding and Appendix B.
Okay, let's take it seriatim. All right, the first amendment she's proposing is on line 24 to also mention Appendix B. Okay? Does everybody see that? The bill does contain an A and B, and so now she's just correcting that on line 24 to include both Appendix A and B. Any objection to that? Hearing none. The second amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The second amendment is to strike out, however, the events of PFQT shall be conducted in compliance with Appendix B, and in place of that, to say by the dates specified in subsection 3115.
So starting on the bottom of page 2 and going into the first line on page 3, the amendment is to strike, however, the events of the PFQT shall be conducted in compliance with Appendix B. And to put in the words by the date specified in section 3115. Does everybody see that? It's on the top of page 3. This amendment will be on the top of page 3. Does everybody understand the amendment? Okay. Any objection to the amendment? Any objection to the amendment? Any senator wish to be heard on the amendment? There being none.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the, I guess we've gone through everybody with on the main motion, unless anybody else wants to speak at this point. Senator.
Mr. Speaker, just one last question, and I'm sorry. I know that if I may
Go
ask
ahead.
one more question. There was a point that was raised earlier by a previous speaker that says that if we adopt new standards or different standards from ones that are existing, that it starts a whole new time clock for even those who have already taken the test and passed. And the implication then in my mind would be that that means that they would now also have to, those who have passed would also have to take the test under these new standards. And I just want to know if that is correct.
That's correct.
And if that's correct, and okay. All right, and I'm just wondering if the author at least would contemplate, or has contemplated perhaps exempting those who have passed the more rigorous standards from having to take even the lesser standards.
Just a point of information, Mr. Speaker, that was one of our concerns. However, let me reiterate that the interim standard was agreed upon and voted on everyone in the Post Commission. So if the agency heads felt that that was doable, then that was doable.
And I understand. It just seems unfair for those who have really worked up to try to meet the standards that are established right now, and they have met it, and then they're now required to do it again in spite of having passed a more rigorous standard. It just seems inequitable. I just need to make that comment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Any other comments?
Mr. Speaker, if I may, if the previous speaker feels that it's unequitable and that he wants to add an amendment to the bill to exempt those that have taken, then by all means, he can do that. But like I said, it was voted on in the Post.
Okay. Any other senator wish to be heard? Vice Speaker.
Bill Wright, Mr. Speaker.
Pardon?
Okay. I was a member, I think, of the Post Commission, a non-voting member when they passed the AFI as their physical standard, and it's unfortunate. I think at the time they really believed that that standard was going to be accomplished by everybody across the board. But I know that in the law and in the rules, again, it states several times that this is supposed to be a minimum standard, and that every agency is still supposed to adopt for themselves additional standards, like the one that the fire department submitted in its testimony, that are specific to the duties of its agency, of course. But the whole point of Post was it was supposed to make some things uniform. It's all about having something uniform. So this is supposed to be a standard that's like the common denominator, and that's what this standard is supposed to be. And on top of that, every agency adds on, particular requirements for its own purposes. But I would just like to point to the last section of the bill, on page 6, it talks about, so we're going to have an interim standard, and they're going to start testing immediately in December 2017, right? Or they're supposed to have tested before December 2017 because, what do they call it? Adverse action is available to these agencies beginning in January 1, 2018, pursuant to the new Appendix A and Appendix B. But then on page 6, we give them a timeline to submit a new standard, or we will revert again to the AFI, the Air Force Instruction Standard, in December 2018. So we see on the first couple lines up there on page 6 that it must be adopted by December 2018, a new standard, or it reverts to AFI. So it's, my issues with the last sentence. The last sentence says the post commission shall be in full compliance with the reverted or adopted standards by January 2020. But I would make a motion to just delete that sentence, Mr. Speaker, because I think it's not statutorily very clear in the first place. But in the second place, when we adopt December 2018 that new standard, that's I think that should just be in place. They'll be tested again in December 2019 under that new standard. So it would either be the AFI or whatever standard we as a legislature adopted. So I think that language is sufficient. So I would move to delete the last sentence, Mr. Speaker.
The Terlahi amendment is to strike the last sentence on line 4 and 5 on page 6. Any objection? Any senator wish to be heard on the motion? Any senator wish to be heard on the motion? Senator Nelson.
Mr. Speaker, the whole purpose of adding that in is to add the layer of accountability, because we're at the 11th hour. We're trying to find something amenable so that everyone. We're just trying to find something that will work for the public, and that third layer of accountability I felt was necessary, so that it requires actions on the leader's part, because many times we don't hold the leader of the agency accountable for many of the things that go wrong. There's no accountability, and so this is in a sense holding the chiefs and saying, hey, you are accountable for this action, so that we don't come back here next year and saying, oh, we cannot meet the standard. And so that was the whole purpose of that additional accountability. So I'd have to object.
Okay. There's been an objection. Any other senator wish to be heard on the Terlahi amendment? On the Terlahi amendment, there's been an objection. You wish to close?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I just want to say I don't object to the accountability portion of it. It's just the dates. So we say we're going to adopt a new standard by December 2018, yet they don't have to comply until January 2020. And so for me, I would like them to comply by January 2019. When we have the new standard, they have to comply right away. So, okay. So may I amend my withdraw my amendment and just change it to 2019, Mr. Speaker, instead of 2020.
Okay.
The last
on the motion to withdraw, there being no objection, the new Terlahi amendment is to change the very last word on line 5 to January 2019 instead. Anyone wish to be heard on the Terlahi amendment to change the date from 2020 to 2019? Senator Nelson.
Just a point of information that I remembered. They asked to implement their own PT program per agency. Then the consensus is that usually in better business practice, it takes about 2 years to implement the research and development of any program. And so that is why we did the year 2020. So when they implement a new program, because each agency is going to have their own specified program, they're asking for time so that everyone will be online with that new program. So yeah.
Is that an objection, Senator? Oh, so no objection, so it's 2019. The amendment is to 2019. There being no objection, there's no objection to the 2019. Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on the bill? Yes, Senator Torres.
Mr. Speaker, I respectfully request that there be an amendment to the sponsors of the bill and that my name be withdrawn as a co-sponsor. I just feel very strongly about the standards, and although I did my best to try to influence the outcome of the bill, I just feel that you know, we're better to just withdraw the whole, better to just do away with the whole statute, because I believe the standards really don't do justice to the objective of health and safety. So I respectfully request that it be amended so that my name be removed.
All right, there's a motion to withdraw the sponsorship of Senator Torres. Any objection? There being none. Do you wish to close?
Mr. Speaker, I just want to thank my colleagues for their input. Yes, we may not always agree, but I respect you wholeheartedly, and I thank you for the contribution that you make, because if we can make something better by working together, then let's do that. And so thank you for your support. I'm very sorry that my co-sponsor feels so strongly about it, to remove her name, but I respect that too. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
On the motion to send the bill to the voting file, any objection? There being none, let's recess until 10 tomorrow morning. 10. Oh, I'm sorry. Pardon?